Hello, everyone. This is Lee Andrews with Akathame, and joining me today is Sonal Ball from Supercharge. So thank you for joining. This is going to be quite the first time I've ever shared this publicly as to why I do not go by my first name, what my first name is, and some other things that have happened to shape the direction that I have taken and the passion that I have for DE&I and have had for decades. So Sonal is here to provide some moral support, but also because it was her podcast. And her podcast is called How I Got Hired. And she featured a gentleman by the name of, and I don't want to butcher his name. It's Ahmad Inman.
Ahmed Imam.
Yeah, I butchered that. So Ahmad shared this story that I'm going to reshare it because I think it's just that important. So back in the day, Ahmad, did I pronounce that right? Had applied for 30 positions, and he used his real name on his resume. And having his name on his resume, it didn't get him any results. And jokingly, amongst his friends, they said, "Why don't you change your name to, because it could be your name that is taking away from your qualifications." So he changed it to Adam Smith. No joke. And the very next day, 24 hours later, he gets 4 invitations to interview. Same resume, same capabilities, same person, different name.
And same company.
Of course, yeah. He sent out the same 30 resumes to the same recruiters, same everything. And the day after got 4 invitations to come in for an interview. So it made me realize what an event, a similar event happened to me. And I'm going to tell you, this was probably 20 years sooner, earlier. And so in 1980, I was a summer student, and I'm going to name names here because where these companies are today is exactly where they should be based on how they interacted with women and people of color. So back in 1980, I was a summer student. Some of our viewers aren't even born then, Sonal. But back at that time, I was a summer student at Eastman Kodak. And if you know anything about Eastman Kodak, they are almost non-existent today. They used to be one of the top, brands in the world. And as a summer student, I was responsible and working on within one of their word processing divisions on the new technology, the digital rainbow, the DEC Rainbow. And that was like the first, outside of the IBM, this was one of the first word processing technologies out there. And so when I was working on this team, I figured out a way to stop the redundancy that was happening. There were only 2 of us doing these updates of standard operating procedures for how the film for Kodak was actually getting made. What was going in that film, how it was being processed, blah, blah, blah. So I came up with what I thought was a pretty ingenious idea to minimize the redundancy, because I saw the same SOPs coming through day after day after day after day. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's got to be a better way. So I submitted my proposal to the head of the department, and it went nowhere. And so I thought, it's a pretty good idea. Maybe it's how I worded it or something. So as I started walking around the floor in the plant, I got to meet other interns, other summer students, and the engineers were all men except for one woman. Everybody else I had met as summer students, the clerical people were the women, and all of the engineers and the big thinkers that they thought were all guys. So I decided to change my name, and I went by my middle name. Now, this wasn't, something that I thought of overnight. A few years before that, while I was in high school, one of the kids that I was babysitting for, her mother suggested to me that as I was beginning to graduate and go into college, that I stop using my first name, that I use my middle name, Lee. She said, "Listen to the sound of that, Paula Andrews. Lee Andrews. She says, which do you think sounds stronger? And I said, Paula Lee Andrews, the way that my mother would call me, Sonal. I mean, you know, when you do something wrong. She said, no, why don't you try Lee Andrews and you'll find that you go a lot further. And so it was at that time in the summer of 1980 where I took off Paula and I went by P. Lee Andrews. Now, boy, did I pick up some slack for that in college when I went into my junior year, my sophomore year. My best friend still today, she said, she still calls me Peely. I mean, that is kind of funny, right? Who thought of that?
It's better than Pee Wee.
Yeah, there you go. So that is why, so I changed the same proposal, same content, same person, same solution, same everything. I just changed it to Lee Andrews. And sure enough, I was called in to review the solution.
Just because of that one change?
Just because I changed my name. From a woman to a, which really Lee is a non-gender, right?
Yeah.
It can be male or female, but back in that day, I was perceived as being a male intern who was going places. But it didn't stop there. After graduation, I became part of, I was a teacher. I was a high school teacher for a little while, but before I went back into teaching, I actually took some time and spent about a year in the staffing industry, which is where I got my first professional job. I went to Bethlehem Steel and I sold the services that I was selling. And the human resources manager told his administrative assistant, which I believe she was called a secretary back in that day, so this was 1983, that I was too aggressive for a woman. That he wasn't going to do business with me because I was too aggressive.
Yeah. I mean, are you surprised? In steel?
I was because I didn't grow up with that. I did not grow up with that. And I'll tell you why I didn't grow up with that. Yeah, I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. And this wasn't actually 83. This was in the late 80s. I'm sorry. This was late 80s because I was teaching and then went back into staffing, into the staffing industry. And just as I was getting ready to leave that job, I got a call from the administrative assistant to the director of HR, and she called and she says, Lee, you did it. Here's your first requirement. Here's your first position. Go ahead and fill it for us. And I said, well, my last day is this Friday. And she goes, well, you can leave on a very good note that you cracked this nut. And I said, you know what? It's not a good note. It's not a good note. This is an indicator that your company is not going to make it into the next century. And guess what? And that was Bethlehem Steel. Where is Eastman Kodak today? And where is Bethlehem Steel today?
Yeah.
Gone.
Yeah.
Gone. And this is what happens. And this is why I know for a fact there's a difference between a bias and a prejudice. A bias is something that can be overlooked or overcome. A prejudice means it's a no-go. So when that man said no-go, when my first proposal to Eastman Kodak was a no-go because I was a woman, that's prejudice. Yeah. When the HR director at Bethlehem Steel said no-go because she's a little too aggressive for a woman, that's prejudice. Only when he got caught in a place where he had no other solution did he decide to call me. And I couldn't be prouder of where all of that thinking took those two companies, because you know that these two people were so low on the corporate totem pole that it wasn't just them. That culture was bred from the top down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where women were squelched, where being a strong woman is squelched. And we see that even happening today. That's still, we're in the 21st century and that still happens today. So let me tell you, Sonal, why I am like the way I am. Because I grew up with immigrant Sicilian parents and grandparents. And historically speaking, these, like most people who immigrate to the United States, they go through hell, for the first generation. They are put through hell. Well, Sicilians were hung. They were lynched. They were cast aside. They were thought that they were less than any other people walking the planet, including blacks. They were just not respected at all, to the point that when my father graduated from high school and was looking at a college, he could not get into college because of his Sicilian background. It took a politician to get him into college. He is the first man in my family to get an advanced degree, let alone any degree, and he became a PhD microbiologist and virologist with patents to his name, traveling the world, helping to solve problems like the coronavirus. Again, prejudices and bias have no place in this world. They will, I promise you, they will crush your organization. It needs to stop. There is no excuse. None. None. So when people ask me why am I so passionate about this? It's because it's real. So what do you think about that, Tonal?
Wow. I want to know. I want to know at Eastman Kodak, what was their reaction when they realized that Lee is actually Paula?
Oh, they said, wow, you really surprised us. I'll never forget the look on his face. His face just got beet red. You would have thought that, I came in, without any clothes on. That's how shocked he was. And, and so he said, this is really good stuff. I think you should implement it. And we did, and it worked beautifully.
Yeah. No, I'm just thinking out loud. And this is one of the world's most advanced economies, right? And you can just imagine what it's like in the so-called developing markets in terms of prejudice and bias when it comes to women and where their place belongs, where the system thinks they belong. So it's obviously changing. It's changing very slowly, but it's changing. So that's positive. But at the same time, I do sometimes, my jaw drops that it's 2020, and are we still talking about, like some stuff that comes up, which is almost every day. It comes up, like, seriously, we're talking about this.
And in many cases of what you see that's happening in the United States, we're going backwards. So the fear of prejudice, the fear of losing whatever power and control that you have, the fear of losing that majority status, the fear of not being king, right, in your own domain, that is very, very evident in what's happening in today's society. And this is why I very carefully curate the companies that I represent, and I carefully curate the talent that I represent. If they are not about diversity and equity and inclusion, I do not represent on either side. It is just that simple. We just don't have any more time for that.
Yeah, no, there's a clear business case. And I was in a masterclass this morning, in fact, talking about unconscious bias. And there are, I think, 100 type of unconscious biases. This is not conscious. This one was conscious in your face. Face. But let's talk about this, Lee, because anyone who's watching and they're like, what can we do? Yeah, men, women, whatever you are, I don't want to put you in a box. What can people do?
They can speak up. They can speak up.
Just like how we are talking right now.
That's all it takes. So you have to draw a line in the sand. So I have no problem telling a hiring manager, I'm sorry, I can't support your requirement. I have no problem telling a candidate, I'm sorry, I can't support your requirement. And trust me when I tell you, I look at social feeds. I look at what you're sharing. I look at what you're saying. I look at who you're connected to. I look at how you represent yourself and how you represent others. If there is any, even a hint of prejudice, of extreme bias, and conscious discrimination, you're nowhere in my universe. There's just no place for it. And the more that we say nothing, the more it will continue.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate that, because what you just said, it's painful to say no to business, right? They'll throw money at you. They're like, no, we only want to work with Lee. We only want to work with Akatami, but they turn out to have, not the same values or lack of integrity. It's tempting, but at the same time, you sleep better at night.
Yeah, it'll come back. What I do comes, what good, bad, or indifferent comes back threefold.
Yeah, it comes around.
It comes around. So I don't care if I'm out on the streets. I need to be able to leave this world with my integrity and dignity intact. That's all I care about, is leaving this world with decency, integrity, and you know, care for
leaving it better than we found it, right? What else? What else can people do?
I would also say that if you are in the position of being discriminated against, or you are being shown extreme bias, use your internal processes to speak up. Go to a higher leader, go to HR, go to the Department of Labor, go to any of the associations out there in your neighborhood close by that can say, hey, we need to address this. But there are all kinds of nonprofit organizations, government agencies that are focused on eradicating these types of behaviors in the workplace.
I have a question for you, Lee. I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So let's say I'm being discriminated against and I'm in the company, or I have a very strong feeling I got rejected because of my gender, my age, my ethnicity, whatever, right? I'm very tempted to do something about it, call them out, whatever. At the same time, there's friends of mine who say, are you nuts? Are you insane? Because that's career suicide. What would you say to that?
I would say, well, pick your suicide. Do you want the suicide of your soul or theirs? How do you want to go? And here's the other thing. We all have a choice, right? So if you are surrounding yourself with people who are telling you to fear the truth and to fear honesty, to push aside your sense of integrity and peace of mind and credibility, then I probably wouldn't be hanging with those people. I want to hang with strong people like you, Sonal, who will say, Lee, you fight that. You go after that and you do what you feel is right to be able to close your eyes and wake up the next morning feeling okay about what you've done. Mm-hmm. I don't want people to instill fear in me.
I think that I promised I will not talk politics, but I think we're at a very fascinating year, 2020, because I think with everything that's happened this year, and not just in the United States, yes, with the death of a gentleman that reverberated around the world, and all the racism. I know we're not talking racism today, but with everything that manifested in other countries, including Belgium, by the way, because they toppled a statue of a guy who was colonizing, very famous person. His statue was toppled in Antwerp because of all the atrocities done in Congo, etc. So I think that this year, and with Corona, it just blew up. I think this is the year that we stop being afraid. I think that companies should start being afraid.
Yep.
Because people have always had a voice. I don't like people saying, I found my, if it's always been there, but you're chosen to speak up.
It's a choice. And it's also a choice as to who you work with. It's a choice of what brand you represent. And it's a choice of career path that you are on or not on. Everything is a choice. People will say, well, I choose to have food and I choose to have a roof over my head and I don't want to rock the boat. And I'm going to say, eventually that boat's going to tumble. Look at where Eastman Kodak is today. Look at where Bethlehem Steel is today. Bethlehem Steel's gone. These
I have to say, I've never heard of it.
Yeah. Why would you? Bethlehem Steel was I mean, they thought they'd be around forever. And you know, when I walked in those companies at the highest levels, the boardrooms were exactly like you would think that they were. Very heavy, dark wood, dark environments, very rich looking, very plush. No women. Women were at the secretarial or administrative desk.
Right, right. And probably it's one of those places, because I can identify, it's probably one of those places where if the women had to use the restroom, they'd have to look really hard where the restroom is.
It was not right in front of them, that's for sure. It was not right in front of them. But, you know, back in the day when George Eastman was alive and when the company originally flourished, it was not necessarily like that. So, I mean, the Eastman Kodak Company never went the route of unions because he paid so well. He respected all the employees, and he made sure that the working conditions were in good shape, so that unions, they just never won a case because the company took care of them. But what happened is, one generation after the other, that arrogance and that greed and that inflexibility and the prejudice and the fear and all of that stuff, just compounded and grew inside that culture. And so it imploded. It just imploded. Yep. Kodak is barely, an ounce of what they were back in the day. So anyway, that's all I've got. Sonal, thank you so much for being part of this. Please thank Ahmad for sharing his story, because it really helped me share mine. And I would say, if anybody is looking for a position, please consider Sonal and watch her podcast. Will you tell them about your podcast?
Yeah. So thank you. First of all, I want to say bravo. Well done, Lee. This takes courage to. Are you okay? This takes courage to speak up. We know that. We always have a choice. You have a choice and you chose to speak up. So I want to say big bravo and lots of emojis and comments for Lee. Yeah, I started this podcast because I think that everybody's got these stories in them. And it's not I have to say, it's not a generic podcast, because there's a lot of podcasts out there on how did you become successful. And there's lots of mindfulness stuff in there. Mine's more one track mind. How did you get hired? How did you get this job? Then how did you get the next job? Because I'm very curious about that, because I think it's going to help job seekers today who are seeing the worst recession in a lifetime to get innovative ideas on how to get that next gig. So I hope that helps.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. And if you're watching it pre-live, don't hesitate to send me any questions, comments, or concerns.